Hey everybody, welcome back to yet another Mobalytics video. It's your jungle expert Flaress back again, and last time I covered the most underrated picks in League, but today I wanted to talk to you all about some of the most overrated champions that you should avoid playing in low elo. Just as a disclaimer here, some of the champions that I'll mention will have the perception that they're godly in low elo, but in reality are just holding you back from climbing any higher than you are now. And if I miss any, politely tell me down in the comments, since that's where positivity breeds, right? And starting off, we have this Croc who's been seen as the Tanner from high school that top laners just can't seem to get a grip on when facing against them. Renekton's problems stem from the fact that he's just outscaled and outclassed by many other top laners in the game right now. He may seem like the bully, but in reality, he's just given the belt back at home by Kled, Darius, and even Set. And that's really mainly because a lot of the other picks provide more for the team than Renekton could. You have some AoE damage, sure, but other champions have point-click executes, multi-target crowd control, and better, more reliable ways to stick onto a target. Ren is also very unreliable in the side lanes and falls flat compared to other split pushers like Tryndamere or Camille, because even if he beats them early, they'll just scale up since games don't end as quickly in low elo. Renekton also just gets easily kited and styled on by the many meta champions in the game that have a gap closer when he tries to group and team fight. I'm sure there have been countless times your team has gotten screwed over when your Renekton slices and dices onto the enemy backline only to be blown up in less than a second and lose you the game. Aatrox is another one of those picks that are amazing in pro play, but end up being a poor choice when it comes to solo queue. A lot of the time, low elo Aatrox players often just miss their Qs, which stops them from getting kills and even snowballing. He scales pretty well, but his weaknesses resides in the fact that he has a poor time getting onto the enemy backline. A lot of the times, he misses out on dealing damage because players overestimate where to place their Qs to land the sweet spot. But not only that, people just flat out miss his tether, which would guarantee his opponent's flash or even just help them snowball even further. And the movement speed and lifesteal bonus Aatrox gets from his ultimate is really helpful, but the reset is even better when you want to clean up shop. However, teamfights are super sporadic in lower elos, as your teammates are just tunneling on different things at once. This just means that you'll lose out on the time frame you can pop off in, which just means half of the time you'll be less than optimal in extended fights. And for our final top laner, we're gonna have to take a look at Irelia. Whenever you see this picked in low elo, you better pray it's somebody smurfing. She is just one of those high skill expressive champions that just has everybody giddy about trying to 1v9 their games, but ends up 4v6ing instead. One of her core problems is the fact that players often just can't manage her passive stacks well enough to trade effectively in the lane phase, and they're constantly forcing bad trades that end up making her lose out on farm. She's also just too heavily reliant on the player's ability to land a thin stun with their E, as well as properly utilize her Q resets on targets. In teamfights, she would generally initiate or follow up with her E or ultimate, but if she misses either, you guessed it, will put out less damage due to having no passive stacks and have no way to get to the backline targets, and ultimately contributing nothing to your team. When she does land her abilities, players are overzealous and often overestimate their damage and survivability and are taken out right off the bat from one mistake. What I'm trying to say is that right now, playing Irelia just takes too much skill in order to have a mediocre impact on the game, and actually having an impact can be achieved by playing much easier champions instead. Moving on to home sweet home, we're going to be talking about Cain. He's one of the most one-trick champions in the game, and before you all band together and unionize to sharpen your pitchforks for even mentioning Cain on this list, just hear me out. As a fellow Cain enthusiast myself, patch after patch, Cain has received some buffs to help his transformation to choose his bruiser or assassin form quicker. But after every patch, he seems to be doing worse and worse. The problem begins with him not actually being a champion until he does transform. He has suboptimal fighting and gets ran over by other subpar junglers simply because they start to stat check him. And speaking about transformation, the next problem lies in the fact it takes forever for low elo Cain players to get their fully completed bar, and if they do happen to get it early, it's often because they died so many times ganking or invading for their orbs. And as the jungler, it's your sole duty to impact the early game and tilt it into your favor, and by choosing Cain, most players don't even get their transformations on average until 13 minutes, where the early game is legitimately already over. Cain is just so underwhelming at the moment that the sheer utility that a Sejuani or Zac brings for their team outweighs what Cain could provide when both junglers are on even footing. You know it's a problem when Rost is the answer to tank picks like them, and he is just underperforming against them in every way imaginable. As for his shadow form, it's just the same old when it comes to any other assassin jungler. People get baited in with the streamers popping off against players in the lower brackets, but when they try and do it, the truth is that they'll get an amazing KDA at first, then toss it in the mid to late game because they couldn't transition the lead. Yep, you knew it was going to be on here, so don't act too surprised. Lee Sin is an overly complex jungler that seems to stay relevant in any meta. You can't just get rid of him, and that's why he's sitting at a whopping 20% pick rate. What makes him so horrible for low elo is the fact that he's just too reliant on his Q for damage. Nearly all of his DPS revolves around landing his Q, and if you miss, many opportunities just fall down the drain. And on the chance Lee does actually land a Q, his mind is telling him no, but his body is telling him yes, as the Lee syndrome kicks in, and they inevitably will take a return Q towards the enemy team and get themselves killed trying to accomplish who knows what. Players also seem to be struggling with the ward hop, and catching people off guard for an insect power play is very rare. Not to mention the other 20 intricate combos Lee Sin players have come up over the years. It just takes too much time and practice to master, because if you keep trying in your games, you're bound to fail and you'll end up botching a teamfight or Baron, which results in you tossing your games and LP. I'm just saying he's hard to master and it takes a lot of time investment to play properly. Yes, he's an amazing champion to invest time into, but if your goal is to climb, pick him up later. There are other picks that are much easier to execute that perform his job a lot better. Next up, we have Elise, who is a staple high elo menace, but for the lower elo peeps, is just not doing so hot. Her weaknesses in the lower elo is the fact that she's meant to be an early game powerhouse, but games just last way too long. Elise players usually generate a lead, but fail to transfer her lead to the teammates effectively so that they can carry her when she falls off. Another reason she's not the best is that players are generally uncomfortable tower diving, which is her bread and butter. It requires all parties involved to know what they're doing, and if somebody messes it up, it just makes the effort not worth it at all. Similarly to Lee Sin Q, your burst for Elise is dependent on how well you can land her cocoon. Sure, you can damage them without it, but you're just giving them time to get away from you or trade back onto you. Landing your cocoon should allow you to burst them down before they can even start to trade back onto you. And she's just really squishy, and if you get picked, you'll just die right off the bat. What players lack is the reaction times necessary to use her repel effectively to dodge damage or even crowd control. Moving on to the mid lane, and yes, Yasuo players, you knew this was coming too. Yasuo is no stranger to the League community as one of the most feast or famine champions in the game depending on the player. Seeing a Yasuo picked in your game should make your blood boil no matter the elo, because he is just that hit or miss. Firstly, his mechanical requirements are way too high. He takes a lot of time investment to play correctly and even more so to master. You have to bob and weave through minions, Q multiple times in order to get your nado, actually land your nado, and even win wall properly in time, which is a challenge for most. Players in the lower brackets play out very impatient and are oftentimes way too aggressive and take risky trades. They lose skirmishes and try to make up for it by AFK farming in the side lanes just to reach their item spikes, just so they could still mess up a mechanic and get themselves killed, only then to type in chat flaming you for their mistake. If Yasuo players just take a chill pill and farm for their item power spikes, they generally do a lot better, because in low elo, players can't even keep up with Yasuo at all. So much in fact that his ban rate is nearly 50%, because players just don't want to have a chance to have to go against a Yasuo that might hard carry or hard feed. LeBlanc is yet another high skill champion where landing abilities are all but crucial. It may not take much just to hit a QW, but not being able to land your chains makes you miss out on a third of the champion's damage potential. Not landing your chains on LeBlanc practically removes a form of hard crowd control, which is almost always needed in lower play in order to fight or get a pick for your team. What really gatekeeps LeBlanc players from climbing are the sequencing of abilities correctly for the maximum damage possible. Oftentimes players just rely on the QW combo way too often and can never explore the depth of the champion. QW may work for some of the time, but lacking the ability to execute more advanced combos is almost like playing the champion with one hand. LeBlanc also suffers because her farming is really poor. Farming in general is already stressful to her, but if shoved under tower, you can forget about all that gold. With LeBlanc, item spikes are very important, and due to how most elo players struggle with the concept of CSing, not being able to CS effectively really puts a strain on her ability to carry games simply because she doesn't have the items to assassinate targets. Sylas middle used to be a menace and is once again creeping back up in popularity, but in lower brackets, he's just not getting the job done. Sylas has been through a mini rework, focusing more on his ability to, you guessed it, land skill shots, and all in with the damage from his E and W. To echo myself however many times I have to, low elo players have a rougher time landing skill shots, and with Sylas it is especially important to hit them, because Riot changed his kit to make it so you are rewarded for doing so, and if you don't, it's just bad news. And in that mini rework, Riot nerfed his wave clear, which makes it harder for him to get his item spikes and roam. Much like Yasuo, Sylas players like to be aggressive and impatient. Relying on the massive heal from his W is often not enough for when he goes in too deep and is ultimately killed for his over-aggression. Because most Sylas players are very aggressive, if played improperly, could make him fall behind and have zero impact and damage for a fight and end up being useless nearly the whole game. Caixa fell from grace after her dominance in Season 9, but she regularly hovers the 10 to 20% pick rate range and is even seeing a resurgence with the new Halo Blades build, but what is really stopping her from being an OP pick? A lot of ADCs will tell you it's their support's fault and that they're not able to climb, but most of the time they're only half right. Positioning and auto-attacking is tough on Caixa. She's short range and has to be in the middle of fights, plus her E attack speed, you have to kite and attack even faster to maximize her damage. Her ultimate, on the other hand, is actually harder than it looks to use properly. You need to be on the one side of the enemy, then aim quickly and ult to the other side to build space, or even over walls. It's just not enough just to get the shield out of it. And getting your autos off on Caixa is already fairly difficult, but landing your W to burst damage is another reason she's being held back, since it applies 2 stacks of plasma. And supports are just not as good in lower brackets, and they give Caixa a lot of damage early from the passive stacks they add, so if they miss their stuff, it just means you're going to be doing less damage as well. From day one, Aphelios felt like you were having to learn rocket science. What players often confuse is how to change their playstyle based on what weapons he currently has. Is Severum the sniper or the lifesteal one? Not only that, but when you play Aphelios, you have to learn the different synergies of his guns, and it is one of the biggest factors in mastering him, because each gun changes his way to approaching fights. And after figuring out what his guns actually do and how they synergize, now you have to sit there and preserve your ammunition well enough so you have enough left in the chamber to fight. Having to learn all of his kit is nice and all to pump out great damage, but is faced with a roadblock with all of the other factors that plague low elo, like farming, trading, and positioning that'll just inhibit him from succeeding. And for our final AD carry, Lucian is one of those aggressive AD carries that needs to get a lead early and close out the game no later than the mid game. He pumps out great damage, sure, but gets outscaled by the likes of Jinx or even Jhin in the late game. The downside to Lucian is that he's extremely short range, forcing him to be uncomfortably close to the enemy to dish out damage, relying on their ability to kite and react to skill shots to reposition with his dash. Since he is so short ranged, his laning phase also takes a nosedive if left against poke mages or hard engaged supports like Zyra or Leona that can easily punish him for being overextended. Mechanically speaking, it's intensive to weave his passive to its fullest potential, chaining his abilities well enough so that he may keep resetting the cooldown of his E and pump out as many auto attacks as he can. Moving on to support, we fittingly have Lucian's wife Senna also joins our list as well. With games averaging around 36 minutes in low elo, you'd think a scaling champion like Senna would be popping off, however you have to factor in most players in low elo struggle with positioning. Speaking of positioning, hook supports are also vastly more popular than enchanters, and if a stray Nautilus Q or Blitz Q connects, it's lights out for Senna, as she is the health pool of an AD carry, which means she is subject to being one-shot and punished harder for poor positioning. Another reason Senna is so overrated is because of the unique but complex abilities to her kit has to offer. Players just don't utilize or often don't know how to use her Q to harass effectively, they miss the snare from her W, or even flat out miss time or even miss her global ultimate. Skill expression is all fine and dandy and everything, but why bother to play a champion if players can't even land the utility she has to offer or gets blown up instantly for positional errors? Next up on the chopping block, we have Pyke. And what makes Pyke so bad in lower tiers is the fact that he cannot benefit from building health items, and he is just so easily punished if he cannot land his E. Speaking of landing his E, most of the time Pyke's dash lands just short of his target and ends up in melee range of the enemy and is left with 0 gap closers or escape tools left to get him out of a sticky situation. It ultimately just invites your team to spam ping you and /all chat the enemy team, asking them to report you for intentionally feeding. It's also worth mentioning that when you pick Pyke, you're also not a conventional support who builds items to support the team. There's no Redemption, Knight's Vow, Zeke's Locket, or any of it really to benefit the team. You're strictly relying on your ability to land your ultimate or crowd control for picks and building lethality. Lethality is a one-way street on Pyke, and sadly building anything but is just not optimal for climbing. Again, skill shots are just so tricky for lower brackets, and asking a Pyke to land his Bone Skewer or Death from below is definitely a tough thing to ask for. The importance of getting a pick and sharing the gold with your team from your cut is too crucial to winning games. It's the difference from mopping the floor of your enemies and just getting mopped on because you couldn't land the X. And for our last and final support, we're going to have to talk about Braum. Braum is definitely a pro pick fan favorite, but for solo queue and low elo, it's just abysmal. Braum is hailed to be the god of peel thanks to him being able to increase your resistances, block major damages from his shield, and lock down players thanks to his 4-hit passive. Though all of it may sound great on paper, in game he just lacks agency and is instant punishment for those who get caught. Sure, he can land a Q and slow them, but if nobody's around or paying attention to the opponent, can just dash out of range and the opportunity is for nothing. Another reason he's just terrible in lower tiers is that mage support such as Brand, Swain, Morgana, or Zyra just poke him out from a distance and force him to stand behind his AD carry, only losing more of the little agency he has. With Braum, you have to be aggressive in the lane phase, but AD carries are generally not mind readers and are often passive when it comes to the lane phase. With Braum, you also have no hard engage. You have your R, but if it's not point blank range, good luck trying to land it from a distance. If you haven't caught on yet, Braum lacking the instant punishment means the team isn't gaining an advantage where they could. But that's all from me, folks. I hope I have given you all just a little bit more understanding and some more reasons to avoid some of these notorious quote-unquote godly champs, and to nudge you all to give something more easier yet effective alternatives to climb with a try. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel where we regularly dish out informational content to help better your play. And thank you all once again, and be safe out there as we all go through these difficult times together as we try to take our minds away from things. As always, good luck in your games, and we'll see you out there on the Rift Summoners.